I'm Beth Pariseau, Senior News Writer at TechTarget, and this is IT Ops Query Season 2, The State of SecOps. Rich Lane is currently IT Director at the City of Medford, Massachusetts, and has had a varied career in IT infrastructure and operations. He served as VP of Digital Operations Strategy for data security software vendor Netenrich from 2021 to 2022, and as a Forrester Research Analyst from 2018 to 2021. Before that, Lane worked as a professional services consultant for observability vendor Splunk and as IT Infrastructure and Operations Manager at Bain Capital. From Lane's perspective, the CrowdStrike outage reflected an organizational disconnect at many companies between the IT security teams that choose tools and the infrastructure operations teams that must support those tools in production. Welcome, Rich. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me today.
So, how have you seen that disconnect between SecOps and NetOps play out over your career, and why do you think it persists?
Yeah, so in the beginning when security sort of became its own discipline, it used to be network engineering or just operations that were in charge of that stuff. Environments involved, we abstracted a lot of systems and broke them into many pieces, put them out, so it became more attack vectors to get into your company, into systems. So what we did was you would usually take your network engineers, or a little more senior sometimes, split them off to be security engineers. There was benefits for them. They got to look at cool new technologies, or they didn't have to be on call, or things like that. So it changed their career paths. And if you've been doing network operations for 10 years, it was a little more exciting and something different to do. But they were generally considered part of operations, and they worked very closely with us. It was very little differentiation, and it was by device, where they worked on ASAs versus switches, but it was still part of the networking infrastructure. So you're just talking to the same people in the same way to get a different result when you were trying to do something with an ops person. Then we kind of started to move it into its own separate discipline, but away from operations. Now it's just an engineering type thing. Still technical, but tools and technology on that side, they're very specific tools. That was still okay. Then around the time, at least for me, of the big Sony breach several years ago, everybody panicked all at once and said, why aren't we investing way more? Because, security has always seemed an arm of operations or an arm of IT. Now it's abstracted even more away from operations and IT into its own discipline. We started to see the CISO role come out. And again, in the beginning, they were more technical people that had come from a technical background. You saw the shift to, as every company tried to fill their organization with security professionals, it was all about certifications. It was all about getting those three-letter acronyms after your name. And a lot of those people weren't technical people or hadn't been hands-on technologists. A lot of it had come from maybe a lower-level engineering position, or just were learning in school and in CS programs and came out and said, I want to do security. I think it's the next big thing. So they were lacking a lot of frame of reference over how the entire operations ecosystem works and how our entire enterprise works. And then it became, so we had some notable breaches. It became this thing where now they're almost elevated above operations as far as budget. They get what they want. As far as they made some organizations not even report to the CIO. You have the CISO reporting right into the CEO or what have you, how the structure is. And it's become a position and a role where it's putting a draconian policy to try to cover every use case that then operations has to live with. So it's like, we had a breach in this area or exposure. Well, what do? Run and get another tool to fill that hole. But we don't actually run it. That's for operations to handle because they're 24/7 and whatnot. So it started to put this divide in between what are the priorities between what security's trying to do and what they're communicating to the top of the company and what operations do. We're trying to run the business and not be in the way of people doing that. Where security is very, nope, this is immutable. You have to follow this policy procedure, use this product, do whatever. But when you look at the statistics, way more than 95% of all the security incidents that happen are remediated by operations to begin with. So it became this thing like, if you guys aren't going to do it, why do we have to support the stuff that you keep dropping on us? And we need to find a way to bring the two back together. And in my last few roles, we were exploring that. Like, how do we tie the CISO and the CIO together, but not just them, the people who are doing the work, and say, hey, and we went through this before with just regular engineering when they divided it up out of operations. Said, you guys built this exchange environment that we can't support it's a lovely architecture, but here's 10 reasons why we can't support it. And they would go back and rework it and would come to a compromise like what we can support and what works for an engineering type of thing. So I think we need to have that conversation again. How do we bridge that gap and make what they're trying to accomplish on the security side workable for us?
And why did that come to your mind with CrowdStrike in particular? Because that wasn't a security incident per se.
Well, I mean, when your malware detection environment becomes malware itself,
Uh-huh.
I guess that's semantics at that point.
Hmm.
It wasn't, but all the writing that I saw out there, with the exception of yours, of course, was pushing towards this is an operation error. This had nothing to do with a security event. Stop calling it that. This is an operations problem. It's like, well, my security company didn't follow even the basic procedures of how to push software to me because you say that I have to be updated on their schedule automatically because things are changing so fast and it's the only way you can do things. And I can't put it in environment in a safe zone of 10%, what area, blast zone, and scale it out that way on my own like I used to be able to do with software. That's how we got here.
Hmm. So that Sony breach you referred to in 2014, why do you think that was a turning point, that breach in particular?
So it's funny. I was just telling the story the other day to someone like why security is such a big thing, and I saw this firsthand. It wasn't that people were worried about IP getting stolen, as it turns out.
Hmm.
It was all the stuff around that. It was all the emails that came out, all the gossiping, all the pay scales of like how underpaid actors were
Mm.
versus men actors. It was what directors were saying about actors. That was what people got scared about. Brand damage, essentially,
Mm.
is far worse than, we got locked out of some Excel spreadsheets for a couple of weeks so we restored backups. And that's what I saw across the board. Big corporations were scared of. I don't want them to know what we're really doing. You think of some of the lawsuits from whistleblowers out there that they put out, of what companies are doing. That's what they were afraid of getting taken.
Hmm. Okay. So, how do you think the industry in general has, if at all, bridged that gap between infrastructure operations and security? And how can they continue to improve that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the software providers, you see so many, and I probably get 30 cold calls a week via email or phone calls from security providers trying to sell me a product that's a security person would use.
Hmm.
And I'm like, you have to start joining the data together, and in Splunk, to some instance, that's what they did in the early days. They were taking operations data, looking for patterns across it and saying
Mm-hmm.
this is anomalous behavior and detection. That was the early days, and people say that SIM is dead or what have you because it's not real time and all this, and you have to protect the endpoints versus the back end. I get all those ideas and conversations and arguments, but there has to be a way to make the data, make whatever is going on in the security tools far more accessible and approachable to operations people because, again, they're the ones that are going to have to go cut whatever off, get someone's laptop off the line or what have you. But we have to do it in such a way where the ops and security people can work together for what's our implementation plan, what's it going to look like, what's our support model, how do we update things, instead of security solely purchasing the tool. And they may be, again, people that it ticks all the boxes, but it's an operational nightmare to support. We have to get those groups talking together again. I think I've seen you write some things about this, and I think more people like that, the analyst firms, things like that, would say you have to bring the two teams together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do think we've seen vendors like Splunk, to your point, bringing those data sets together or looking to do so. And it is interesting because it is sort of like that old pre-DevOps, well, it worked on my machine conversation between developers and IT ops. And to some extent, issues like CrowdStrike are an artifact of our current world that's so dependent on software and cloud and distributed systems and everything's connected. So there are some people who put their hope in AI and advanced automation to try and stem the flood of security breaches and
Yeah.
improve the overall security posture of enterprise companies. Is that something that seems hopeful to you at all, or?
I think definitely with the amount of endpoints we have, and you think about IoT and computer at the edge and all that stuff, which was just shades of going back to what we used to do, putting computers close to where people are.
Mm.
But, you're going to have more stuff to protect and monitor and see. And, people want to monitor power plants from 6 states away and things like that. There's a lot of data there. You say AI, what does AI really mean? I've always said this even as an analyst. I think there's implementations of math, basically what it comes down to, and being able to look at that data that's maybe very consistent and very light, but find that needle in the haystack. And that's where it really does come out. And when I was working with AI ops companies as an analyst, that's where I was like, okay, now you're onto something. You're taking all these signals, all this disparate data in, and you're able to say where we used to get, messages on lots of false positives because we can only set a range. Well, maybe that anomaly that you're seeing today is normal on a Tuesday at 9:30 in the morning. But I don't know that because I have to take care of thousands and thousands of machines and VMs and whatnot. And the systems get smarter in that and say, I used to use the joke at Splunk of like, well, anomaly detection is Mary in accounting watches cat videos at noon every day. That's not an anomaly because we know it happens every day.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe I just came in, I work night shift, but I come in during the day and I see this thing going on. I'm like, oh my God, did we have a breach? We have something going on. We pull our machine off. So I think if the system gets smarter in that and looking at the data, being able to tell us what's good from bad type of thing, I think that's where it has to head.
So, how do you think SecOps is going to evolve in the next couple of years? Do you think it'll ever be ahead of attackers? Do you think it'll ever be proactive rather than reactive?
The biggest thing you see is the number of breaches that you actually see aren't really from people getting in, like going through something, a system to get into you. It's the human engineering, the social engineering
Mm-hmm.
stuff. I'd say
Right.
that's the biggest problem we face. Now, again, you want to have systems in place to protect your endpoints just so users, I've seen it a million times, user is used to getting an email from somebody, a financial institution, whether they work in accounting, they get a phishing email, they're trying to close out books for a quarter, they're on a 16-hour day, and they say, oh yeah, I wire transfer the money, and I've seen it firsthand happen.
Mm-hmm.
That's a training thing, and I work with people now in my new role that aren't sophisticated with computer use, but I put training systems in place where they have that sense of like, this doesn't feel right, I better call somebody and have the experts look at it. I
Right.
think we are remiss in a lot of companies that they put out the once a year cybersecurity half-hour training, your mandatory thing you have to take. That's not really going to do it. You look at the MGM breach in Western Mass at the casino. That was somebody calling up as an IT person saying, "Hey, lock myself out of my account. Can you reset my password for me?" Oh, sure thing. And that made me think I have an MSP that does my help desk. How do they validate my employees? And we had a whole meeting and put some systems and process in place around that. I think there's a lot of people out there still haven't even done that yet. And I
Right.
think, but I think the security companies and the SecOps people, that's where they really do have their value. Is instead of pushing out just policy after policy, they need to also go out and train people. They need to
Mm.
find people that need more training. It's very successful when they do. They don't tell anyone. They bring an outside company in. The sophisticated ones tells you who fails and who needs a little more hand holding. I think that's the biggest thing that they can do for a company is do that. And it's like I said, it's I'm not trying to do away with software. They are is an important place, but it's really the humans that get you in the most trouble at the end of the day.
Yeah. Cool. So, anything else you wanted to mention I haven't thought to pick your brain about?
No, I think it's an interesting time as far as security because it seems like every 2 3 years we have these major breaches. You think of SolarWinds, that was a big one I worked on. That put a lot of panic into people. But then you start peeling back the layers of what happened. The companies that this happens to, the product companies, software vendors, need to do a better job at owning it when it happens and not try to hide it from their customers and not send out emails to their customers with a legal disclaimer is bigger than the actual message.
Huh.
So they have to be more honest and say, yeah, we screwed up. We're going to figure out how this happened. We're going to communicate with you. One of the things I saw online when I woke up the morning of the CrowdStrike thing was that they were paywalling the solution only to support paying customers. And you can't do that because a lot of the software companies let you have two technical contacts, say.
Yeah.
Well, if both my technical contacts are on the West Coast US and Australia is the first place that it's happening in Asia Pac somewhere, and they can't get a hold of them or whatever, that we never didn't have an updated on-call roster, are they supposed to wait 8, 10, 12 hours
Hmm.
behind the paywall? Publish the answer right away when you're in the middle of something like that. Put it out there. So I think when these things happen, these companies, they have to do a little better job around the messaging and how they're going to help people fix it and remediate it. It seemed like at the beginning, Microsoft was more helpful than CrowdStrike was.
Hmm. Interesting. Of course, Microsoft's had its own problems, like the email breach that affected federal government agencies. It's hard to see that happen to a company that's one of the largest security vendors in the world in its own right and
Yep.
think there's hope for the rest of us, right? It just almost feels like it's inevitable that everything's getting breached.
It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. You know,
Yeah.
that's the sad part of
Well, on that cheerful note,
it.
thank you for being with us, Rich. I really
No
appreciate
problem.
your insights.
Thank you. Anytime.
This has been IT Ops Query Season 2, The State of SecOps. If you have any feedback on this episode or want to share questions, comments, or stories we should consider covering, please reach out to me at B as in boy, P as in Peter, A-R, I, S as in Samuel, E-A-U at techtarget.com. Please consider rating, reviewing, and subscribing to this podcast on your platform of choice. And tune in next week for our continued conversations with industry experts about the challenges facing security operations. Thank you for being with us so far.